So I'm just going to draw out a quick flower. What you can do, you can go onto the internet, do a search for images, search for a flower, and just choose one that you think might be quite interesting or easy to draw. So if I just do that, there we have a quick flower. So I've got my paints here, I've got my brush here. There it is. I've been dipping my brush in the water to make sure the bristles are wet. Here is my water. I'm going to put that back over to the side, and I've got a little paper towel underneath the water so I can dry the brush off if it feels like there's too much water on it. So I am going to dip into, I'm going to choose quite a bright pink colour. So dip into there, get a lot of paint on the brush, and I'm going to paint one petal. So I'm just going around the edges of the one petal. This is a lovely, lovely, vibrant pink. I'll just fill it all in. I've gone over the edges, like that. Okay, now when that dries, it will dry a lot paler. So when watercolour paint is wet, it's much darker or brighter. It has a lot more colour to it. When it dries, the colour fades a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the same pink, and I'm going to go into another one of the petals, but I am importantly choosing a petal that does not touch the first petal I've painted while the paint is wet, because if I chose to paint that petal beside that one while the paint was wet, the edge would bleed over into the wet paint on this petal, and so I wouldn't get a sharp edge round there. It would blur into the paint over there. So the trick is wait until your paint is dry before you paint something next to it, immediately next to it, if you want the edge to stay sharp. Okay, I am going to now paint another petal. So this paint is dry here. It's dried quicker than that paint. That paint was wetter, there was more water in it. So I'm going to dry this one here because this is completely dry. And what I'm going to do over at this side here is I'm going to wet my brush, clean the paint off it, and then go back in with just a wet brush and pull this paint over so it's paler in front of this petal behind it here. Contrasts are something I really go for. Anything next to anything else, I always try and make it have a decent bit of contrast to help give the sort of 3D look to whatever you're painting. So yeah, it's practically dry, so I'll do the same over here. So what I'll do in this one, just to show you, is cleaning my brush again, and I'm going to dip my brush into a different colour. So I'm putting a little bit of a sort of yellowy orange on there, and while the paint is still wet, I just add that colour in, and it blends beautifully. So I hope you can see that sort of more orangey colour appearing there, and it's completely blended. And you can just tip your paint into the wet paint with the other colour on it, and it just gives a lovely mix of colours right there without you having to do very much work. Now, a tiny bit of pink on my brush, and if you see that, the water's doing the work. Look at that, the water's blending that. If you're painting flowers, I always think it's a great idea to at the very least, have two colours in each petal. If you've just got one colour, it can look lovely, but it can look quite plain. You add one more colour into the petal, and it just transforms it. Like so. Just throw that on there. And this is so. While we're waiting for that one to dry, I'm going to go in with a little bit of blue to darken an area. So this one here, because it's behind, I'm going to darken there because it would have some shadow from the petals in front of it. So just added blue, which makes it purple. I've added blue, and putting the blue on top of the pink makes it purple. And then I've cleaned my brush of the paint and go back in with a damp brush with just water, and I'm pulling that out to blend that purple. So while this paint is wet, I can go straight into it with the darker blue to give me the purple right here as well. So instead of waiting for it to dry and then going in with the other colour, I go right in with the purple there. It gives a lovely dark shadow, and the water does the job of blending it. So I'm going to do something similar with this petal here. I'm just going to go in with a pink though. So this petal is already dry, so I'll need to add a bit of water to help it blend. So I've just cleaned the paint off my brush, dried it a little, and then I'll just dab that water on. Now I'm not going to go right up to the edge there because that's still a little bit damp. I didn't wait for that to dry, so I'll just stop before I get to the edge. And I think what I'll do is, this petal's looking a bit flat, so I'm going to go and get a little bit of the yellowy orange. This is dry, so it's fine for me to paint on top. And if I do that, wash the paint off the brush, go back in with a damp brush and blend it. Okay, so over here I can probably go for this petal now. I didn't pull this paint right to the edge, so this petal should be fine for me to paint just now. Okay, I've just washed the pigment off the brush and I'm going back in with the brush with water rather than paint. And I'm just pulling out the colours just to make sure there's a difference in the intensity of the colour between that petal and that petal and that one and that one. And we've got this petal over here. It's surrounded by dry petals, so again I'll just get some colour. I'll go into it. I don't want to go very far out because it's a small petal, and when I add water to this it will spread it out. So I'm washing the paint off my brush, going back in with the damp brush. And again, there's a lot of pigment there, so I'm washing that off my brush again, making sure I go in with a completely, not a dry brush, but a brush that doesn't have any paint in it. And I'll just dab some water on to help it blend, to take away the hard edges. Again, I'll wash the pigment off my brush, go in with a wet brush with no pigment on it. When I say pigment, I'm just talking about the paint. Okay, and that helps give a decent contrast between that petal and that petal. I'll go in round the edge. So it's as if the petal in front is casting a shadow on the petal behind it. Okay, that's showing as quite blue, but and every time I'm washing, in between my brush strokes, I'm washing the pigment off the brush, so that when I go back to blend it, there'll be less pigment and you won't see a hard edge between the paint I've just put on and the dry paint behind it. Washing the pigment off my brush and going back in with the damp brush. It's just damp with water. Now I would like to add a little bit more colour to these ones, but I have painted this flower pretty dark, so it's going to be quite difficult for the additional colour that I put in to show up, but sometimes it can be quite subtle and it's nice. So I'm just going to add some of the yellow in. So with watercolour you cannot really paint light colours on top of dark colours, but you can do it to this degree where I'm just adding a bit of yellow on top of there. It will show through a little bit. It's not going to appear as yellow, but it will just give you variations of colour when you look at it rather than it just being plain pink. While I'm waiting for this petal to dry, because I want to paint the middle of the flower, I think I'll draw in a stem. We're just going to go in with a green. Greens in watercolour can be pretty unrealistic greens, so quite often if I use a green straight from the paints, I'll usually add another colour to it at the same time. So I'm just adding yellow into my green. I'll also go in and paint the leaf as well. So what I'm going to do is go back in with a darker green in a minute. But I'll paint the whole leaf in the palest green that I want. There we go. And I will darken the green now by adding a little bit of Payne's Grey. And if I go in while the paint is still wet, it should help it blend, although the paint's dried very quickly. So I'll do that, and I'll put a little bit here. And then I'll go back in and do what I do, which is clean the pigment off the brush and go in with a clean damp brush and just add the water in. Same here. All these variations between the darkness and the lightness help to give your painting a degree of depth, so everything doesn't look flat and have the same intensity. So while we're waiting for the stem to dry, let's go back in and paint the centre of the flower. Now I've realised I've made the centre of the flower, of this flower, pretty big. I don't even know what flower it is we're painting. However, it's just a general flower. And I'm just going to go in with a pale pink just now. And I'm going to go back in and darken it as well. So I'll wait for that to dry. Actually, I won't wait for that to dry. I'm going to go back in while it's wet and allow the watercolour to do the blending. So if I just go around the edges like so, that'll give you a darker edge. So I am going to wait for it to dry now, and I'll go back in with a little bit more colour once that's dry. And in the meantime, our stem has dried, so I'm going to go in with more green. I think it's a bit peely-wally looking. So I've done the whole leaf, and once that's dry, I'll go back in with some darker green as well. But what you can also do is, if you've painted a colour in and you think it's just a wee bit too dark, you can go back in before it's dried, and that pulls up some of the pigment. Do the same thing here. It's quite subtle, but it works. So I'm looking at the flower, and I think we want the centre of this to be even darker still. It's a touch damp, but I'm going to go for it. I'm going to risk it. I'm going to go back in. I'll just darken the very bottom of it. So these contrasts all help to give a sense of depth to whatever you're painting. I think it's called chiaroscuro, working with contrasts. So there we have it. I'm going to stop there. I'll bring this up a wee bit closer for you. Is there any point? I don't know if there is. It's not. The focus isn't refocusing, so I'm going to put it back down there. But I'm going to stop now. That's just a simple flower for you to get you going. I hope you've enjoyed this, and I will speak to you soon. Okay, thank you very much for watching. Bye-bye.